In this module, we're going to be looking at using group policy to manage Windows 10 desktop settings as well as application settings. In this first section, we're going to go through group policy really as a whole, with the one exception being the application settings, which we'll do in the next section. But group policy, as we'll see, is configuration management inherent to Active Directory. And configuration management just speaks to the ability to really reach out and modify various settings for users as well as client computers in an enterprise environment. You certainly can use it in a small to medium-sized business as well, but the level of control may vary in those environments. Group policy gives you really the ultimate control and being able to conform how the desktop looks, to conform what users are able to do, to deploy applications and control which applications are accessible to users, all of those things. Group policy is actually a very large topic, and it's one of those interesting ones in that group policy settings apply to client computers. If you're a desktop technician or level 1 support, you certainly deal with the effects of group policy, but you might not actually create them. You might have nothing to do with that part of the process, and yet at the same time, the client level exams, such as this one that Microsoft has produced traditionally, have always been pretty heavy on group policy and asking, in my opinion, questions that are more relevant to an Active Directory course or exam. But it's just the way that it is, and it's always been that way. And so this is an area where you might not get in and touch and play with this on a daily basis, but it is going to be critical that you understand exactly how group policy is applied and how to troubleshoot it on behalf of clients. So before we, though, get into group policy, we actually want to focus a little bit on the local computer policy. Every system, whether they're a domain member or not, does have a local computer policy. Sometimes the term is used, the local group policy editor, which is sort of an oxymoron because it's not a group policy. It doesn't apply to multiple computers. It just applies to this one computer and then to any users who are going to log on to the computer. And local policies will provide a high level of customization, especially when it comes to local security. They can be used in special scenarios. They certainly can be used in work group environments because they give access to some settings that really the only other way to configure is by going in and directly editing the registry. So from that perspective, they are the final graphical tool that you can use to configure a lot of these things. In a domain environment, you can use local policies, but that would be our special use scenario because normally in a domain environment, you have domain-based GPOs. And if and when a local policy conflicts with a domain policy, it's the domain policy that's going to win. Okay? So you wouldn't go through and set a bunch of local policy settings in a domain environment, especially not if those same settings are set in a GPO, because the GPO is the one that's going to win out. Now, just to state from the outset here, a conflict is not it being configured in one place and not in another. I think we talked about this when we were looking at local security policies. If it's not configured in the domain and it's configured in the local policy, or vice versa, that's not a conflict. A conflict is the same setting configured differently. And so in domain environments, you're going to use domain-based GPOs. In work groups and special use scenarios, you might use local GPOs. Now, there's the local security settings that we've already looked at. That is secpol.msc. That's also available in the Administrative Tools section of Control Panel. And you have the local group policy editor, which I've opened several times, gpedit.msc. Or you can add the group policy object editor to the Microsoft Management Console. And if you use the latter there, you will have the ability to change the focus of that policy editor. And it actually allows me to create what are called multiple local GPOs. Now, there's only one local policy that affects the computer, but you can have multiple policies and set them to affect different users. It's not very heavily used from my experience because once again, it would really only be useful in predominantly non-domain environments. And in non-domain environments, we often just don't have the same level of necessity for a lot of these settings. Well, let's go in and look at the local policy. I know we've looked at security policy, we've done GPEdit several times, so let's actually just open up the MMC, and I'm going to use the File menu to add the Group Policy Object Editor snap-in. When you add it, it immediately asks you where you want to focus it. So we can focus it on the local computer policy. We can add it again and hit Browse, and instead focus it on particular users. Okay, so notice I can actually apply a policy to individual user accounts, or I can also apply policies for standard users and for administrators. So we can go in and say, okay, let's do the non-administrators policy, and that's what I'm talking about on the multiple local GPOs. When you expand local computer policy, you've got computer configuration and user configuration. The user settings, if you apply them here, would apply to everyone that logs on to the computer. And then certainly the computer settings apply to the entire computer. Down under this non-administrators policy, I only have a user configuration. Okay? And so if you set in both places, the user configuration in the local computer policy would be the one that wins, but I'm going to stop right there and say we're never going to do that. We don't need to, if you want a policy to affect everybody, then you just put it in the local computer policy and then it affects everybody. You would not have any reason to then go and set a per user policy for the exact same setting. Okay? And as I said, I mean, this is not going to, you want to know that it exists. I have not found many places where we were going to use it. It was introduced in Windows Vista, and I remember the first time I saw it, I thought, oh, cool, you can do multiple local user policies. And then I started thinking through it again, and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, what situation would we be using this in other than a workgroup scenario? And in a workgroup scenario, we just usually don't have these needs. Okay. So you can configure this. One nice thing about the local computer policy is the fact that it's structured exactly the same as a group policy object. The difference is simply who is affected or what is affected. And so you can use it to get familiar with group policy and all the settings that are available to you, even if you don't have, or if you don't have access to, say, the group policy management console, you don't have Active Directory rights to be able to create and test GPOs. You can use this as sort of a form of learning. And so it is beneficial in that way. So group policy is an inherent part of Active Directory. It has been ever since Active Directory was originally developed, which was way back in Windows 2000. And it's always been the configuration management part of Active Directory. There are numerous benefits to this. It is centralized administration to a T. When we use that term, centralized administration, talking about a domain environment, we're speaking to the fact that administrators can create accounts. All the accounts are created in the same place on the domain controller. The accounts are managed in the same place on the domain controller. And a user uses the same account to log into any computer, to access resources across all computers in the domain. And so that is centralized administration, but group policy is even more so centralized administration. And the reason is because with group policy, you can actually create GPOs, a group policy object, on the domain controller and have the settings in that GPO affect every single computer or user in the domain. And the level of control that you can actually implement is actually somewhat staggering. There are thousands of settings in domain-based GPOs. And you have the ability to put them into place without ever touching a local computer, without visiting the local computer. And so that right there is centralized administration to a T. You know, we can control desktop environments. I can control what shows up, what utilities are accessible. You can control data access. We can restrict applications. We have a whole slew of security controls. We can map network drives, configure Microsoft Edge properties or Internet Explorer properties, deploy applications, configure folder redirection. We could go on and on and on and on. And so the amount of control that this gives you is great. You know, and with it comes a caution. right? You have a lot of responsibility when you start working with group policy because of the massive effects that it can have. Improper planning of group policy is often the cause of all kinds of issues. And so we've got to be careful to exert the appropriate level of control, number one, and to make sure that we've planned and tested that control before we just throw it out into a production environment. Okay? So both of those things are very key. Ultimately, group policy has always been said to lower the total cost of ownership. And that's, of course, an infamous phrase that Microsoft always uses for a lot of its products. What do we mean by that? Well, the total cost of ownership is just the total cost of managing and maintaining a network full of systems, in this case, Windows 10, and user accounts. You know, managing and maintaining is doing things like making certain data accessible, controlling access to some applications, making sure certain applications are always there, making sure certain desktop settings are in place. And group policy lets you do that in a very easy way and thus lower that total cost of ownership. There's another way in which it lowers the total cost of ownership, and that is if you are restrictive in nature and you're restrictive with what the users are able to do, then you limit their ability to mess things up. You limit the likelihood that some application will be uninstalled or a drive mapping will be deleted, thus causing a loss in productivity because you have implemented them via group policy. And if the user's even able to do some of those things, which in many cases they're not, but if they're able to do it, the policy settings would make sure that the settings were returned the next time the user logged in. So that's how we lower the total cost of ownership. It also can provide decentralized controls. So I made a statement of linking a GPO to the domain and having it affect absolutely everybody. You can also have GPOs that affect individuals or individual computers or individual departments, divisions, locations. Because you can link GPOs also at the organizational unit level in Active Directory, you are limiting the scope of that GPO. You're limiting who and what it affects. Now, there are two types of policies that we've got when we open up a domain-based GPO. And I don't know that we've seen this. Well, I think we've opened up a domain-based GPO once, but I didn't make note of it. And those two types are settings, okay, also just called policies, but trying to differentiate, settings and preferences. Now, traditionally, settings have been the only type of setting in a GPO. And the preferences only were first introduced back with Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008. But the preferences are very useful. We need to understand the distinction between these two, though. Settings are mandatory configurations. And by mandatory, we mean mandatory. The user is unable to change them. In fact, in some cases, the user interface is, or in most cases, the user interface can be completely disabled. It might even disappear. It just depends on what the setting is. So if I've configured Windows Updates, for instance, via group policy, then if you went into the Windows Update section of the Settings app in Windows 10, those controls would be grayed out. Okay? You would not be able to modify them. If I disable the run command and you use the Windows R shortcut, it will just come up and say this is restricted. And I have no ability to change that. Also, these policy settings don't persist if the policy is removed. So if I've put restrictive controls in a GPO, it's in effect for you, but then once the GPO is removed, if it's removed, the settings go right back to the way that they were. And the reason is that policy settings don't actually modify areas of the registry that a user can modify. They don't modify the actual portion of the registry. Let's say I'm forcing a certain desktop background and I'm not allowing people to change desktop themes. It's not actually modifying the part of the registry where that information is stored. It's modifying this special system area where the administrative templates are stored. And so when you log in, it sees those settings in the administrative templates and it uses those settings, but it doesn't change the original values. That way, when the policy is removed, the administrative template settings are removed, and it just goes and reverts right back to the original. That's key, and the reason I'm going into it in that detail is because it's distinct from preferences. Now, let me say at the start, preferences are awesome. I mean, the preferences, when I first saw them, I thought, wow, this is great. I mean, it was the first big upgrade to group policy over a couple of versions, and it just opened the floodgates on what we were able to do. I mean, there were already thousands of settings that we could use in group policy objects, but there were certain things you couldn't do, like create desktop shortcuts, create a list of favorites in Internet Explorer, map a network drive was not possible. Now, all of those things were possible via scripting, and you could use the group policy objects to deploy the scripts. But with preferences, we have a graphical tool in which we can do those things and so many more. So they opened the floodgates and gave us access to a lot of options that we didn't previously have. But we just have to understand that they act fundamentally different. They are non-mandatory configurations. So if you map a drive, the user is able to actually delete the map drive. Okay, now, by default, next time they log in, the map drive will be right back, but that is the case. If you were to use preferences to modify the settings, say, for your Edge web browser or Internet Explorer, and change the home page, a user would be able to modify that home page. They'd be able to modify the settings for the start menu, for the taskbar, for any number of other things that are available in preferences. The user interface is not disabled for preferences, and the preferences are just changing that area of the registry where these settings are actually stored, so the user is able to modify it. Because of that, it's also persistent. If you remove a policy, whatever your preferences, whatever changes they made, they stick. They call it tattooing the registry. Basically changing the original. So there's no way to revert back to the old way because the original value was actually changed. So, just kind of in a nutshell, these settings, policy settings and policy preferences both have a purpose. You need to figure out, if you're the one creating the GPOs, you need to figure out which one we want to use. If I want something to be mandatory, then I'm better off going and finding the setting in the group policy settings area, as opposed to using a preference. Because a preference, by default, would allow the person to change it, and then every time they log on, it would go back to the same way. So the question is, for instance, do you want to force a home page? If you want to force a home page, then go do it in the policy settings. Don't do it in preferences, because it won't really force it. It'll just it'll just keep reverting it. All right. So every scenario is going to be a little different. Sometimes preferences are more appropriate. Sometimes preferences are the only option, like desktop shortcuts and map drives and data sources for line of business applications, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but we do need to understand the fundamental difference between these two types of settings. Regardless of the type of setting, whether it's a setting or a preference, policy settings are going to affect both users and computers. Okay, now, most settings are found under either computer configuration or user configuration, but not both. If you configure settings under the computer configuration, you're configuring settings that will affect any user that logs on to a particular computer. Now, we are in the domain, and so I'm creating a GPO, but if I create a GPO that has a bunch of computer settings in it, then I need to make sure that it's being applied to computer objects, and we'll see how that is done. A GPO full of computer settings that's linked to an OU that contains only user accounts does nothing, and vice versa. So there are settings in two different places. Settings for users will affect the users that are under the scope of that GPO wherever they log in, and settings for computers will affect all users on that particular computer, assuming it's under the scope of the GPO. Okay, so that again is, or that's just another, I should say, important aspect to how this is applied. You may have noticed something already. I'll go ahead and say it now. Group policy applies to user objects and computer objects, meaning group policy has absolutely nothing to do with groups. I don't know why Microsoft chose the name group policy, but they did it 15 years ago, and I don't think it's going to change. So it's just something we always have to say from the outset. You don't apply group policy objects by linking them to a group in Active Directory. Instead, it's going to be based on containers like domains, sites, and OUs that actually hold other objects. If you were to link a GPO to an OU that only had groups in it, it would have no effect. No effect whatsoever. It's got to be scoped to user and computer objects, and that's why you've got in a group policy object computer configuration and user configuration. All right, so poorly named, but you just have to understand that from the outset. This is who it affects, and it doesn't have any effect on groups.